Hello, my name is Victoria A. Woodkowitz, and I am an author and the founder of Red Bicycle Books Publishing. Today's Writer's Block Workshop series, we're going to cover outline mapping for your first book, Organizing for Success. And these Writer's Block Workshop series are basically aimed at helping first-time authors succeed in their writing ventures. So what we're going to talk about today is basically the way to get your thoughts out on paper to understand how you want to organize your novel. And we're going to cover the following: some types of writing outlines. Now, I'm going to say that there are several different types of writing outlines out there. I'm going to cover a handful of them. And there's really no right or wrong answer on how you use outline mapping to create your novel. You actually might find using multiple writing outlines will be helpful for you. We'll go over some examples of what that might look like visually, some questions to ask yourself while creating your outline, some goals to set for yourself, and troubleshooting techniques. So, outline methods. The first one we're going to talk about is the synopsis method, clustering, mind map, the snowflake method, and the skeletal outline. And actually, I use about 3 of these on a regular basis. So let's look at the first one, the synopsis outline. I like to refer to the synopsis outline as the elevator speech of outlines. So basically, if someone asked you what your book is about and you only had one sentence to deliver your main idea, this is where the synopsis outline really shines. The synopsis outline pays a high level attention of detail from start to finish. The goal of this method is to get your brain thinking about laying down ideas for each chapter of your story, hence formulating a synopsis for what happens in each chapter and how it eventually ties to the main plot or theme of your story. I've seen many variations of visual representation of the synopsis outline, but in my personal experience, the way that I implement it is actually using a questionnaire approach. So let's take a look at that. I like to think of it as basically you're interviewing yourself of what the story is about. And the way I like to do it as a high level view, so basically the entire book, and then also doing a more detailed chapter questionnaire. So these are just a handful of questions to ask yourself to just get yourself thinking about how you want to cover certain topics and details of your story. Number 1, what is the title of the book? Now, you may or may not have a title immediately on hand for when you start writing your book. But one of the things I like to do in my writing is to at least create a working title. And the reason for that is it keeps my focus on my overall story. So I think it's important to at least get something crafted, and you can always change it later down the road. Number 2, what is the overall main plot, punchline, and or delivering message that you are trying to ask? So basically, when you're writing a story, I like to think of it as a contract that you're setting with the reader. What is it that they're expecting to get out of the story? What is the main question that should be answered by the time they are finished reading the story, considering it's not a sequel? Number 3, identify all character names and their roles. Is there enough content to craft their uniqueness in the story? So the way I like to think about it is, what are the personality traits? What are the quirkiness of these characters? How do you identify them to decipher these characters and their importance in the story? Number 4, what is the time frame? You may have a story that you're writing that will take place in one day. Maybe it happens in 1 hour, or a series of years that tell the story. Or you might have a story that jumps to and from different time periods. I actually wrote a story called The Cryptic Mansion that I had 2 different time frames that I was writing the story and what's happening to each of the characters and how this kind of intermingles together. And the reason I kind of make a mention to this is because of the fact that when I was writing this story, I actually wrote one time frame completely all the way through, and then I went back and wrote the other time frame all the way through, because that helped me to keep my focus on each of the time frames and the characters details. So that's important too for how you're actually going to physically end up writing the novel. So then ask yourself, does the time frame change from chapter to chapter? You want to create some kind of sense of structure for your novel. Okay, let's look at a chapter questionnaire. So one of the main questions you want to ask yourself is, what is the deliverable in the chapter? What is important to make sure that I am covering with the characters, the plot, and how does this deliverable tie into the main theme? This is really important because you want to ensure that each chapter is building from the previous chapter for several reasons. One, it's creating interest, um, and it's also helping to build suspense in your story. I like to make mention of, I don't like to necessarily create words to just create words to create chapters. If they're not supporting the main theme of the story, something you want to think about is going back to mapping this out as, do I need to include this, or is this creating a distraction to the reader? You want to potentially avoid creating chapters that don't support the main theme, as they can create disinterest or confusion for the reader. Number 3, does the chapter entice the reader to turn the page to the next chapter? So are you creating that character disaster or cliffhanger effect, driving tension to the story as you're building this suspense along the way? The way I like to kind of do this is a couple ways. One, I might actually kind of stop the action of what's happening to the characters in mid-sentence. So that kind of forces the reader to wonder what's happening next. Or sometimes I like to just simply ask the reader the question, and it kind of gets them thinking of, well, what would I do potentially in this situation, or if I was in these characters' shoes, and what have you. Number 4, what idea leads into the next chapter? So again, making sure that you are making a fluid story that keeps unfolding as you go along. Let's talk about the clustering outline. So I like to think of this as an intense brainstorming session, or basically a mind dump of multiple ideas that you may or may not end up using in your story. And I like to kind of think of it more as a tree structure where you're using branches to support the main theme of the story. So you would start basically with the title, and then you want to further delve into your characters, identifying the antagonist, protagonist, your plot ideas, and further basically adding details until you've exhausted all possibilities for the characters, the plots, and so forth. That's really going to give you a nice detailed view of where you're going with your story. The mind map outline is very similar to the clustering outline method, only the mind map is commonly done after you've written your first chapter. So you may ask yourself a question, why would you do something like that? Well, first of all, the first chapter is really setting the foundation, the tone of the story. So it gives you an idea of kind of where you're focusing your thoughts. And then this allows you to figure out, well, where do I want to take this story from here? And do I have enough bulk to turn this into a full novel? So again, just another approach that you can utilize of just getting some details down on paper and then going back to kind of the thought process behind it and how to develop that. The next method is the snowflake outline method, which was developed by American author and physicist Randy Ingermanson. And it's basically a mathematical approach utilizing a fractal based system by assigning different shapes to represent a visual gathering of thoughts. This is a good approach for being a very detailed way of fleshing out the details, because basically what you're doing is you're starting with one idea and building off of that, hence the snowflake that you're developing into further details. So basically, it's kind of like a visual where you would start with the triangle, which represents the main idea in the simplest terms as one sentence. Then looking at it as a visual for a star, which will take that one line sentence and develop it into a paragraph. The basic snowflake, kind of a crude model, diving into explicit points, and a more detailed snowflake. This portion is very structured, basically going into a 4-page synopsis of your story. And I will kind of walk through that visually of what this looks like in just a moment. The skeletal outline method is more or less a bare bones model of your writing. And this probably provides you with the most flexibility, as you're just kind of thinking of it as a summary outline of jotting down chapter 1, cover this, the characters I'm going to cover, and so forth. And I actually use this a lot because it gives me a lot of flexibility for understanding where I can kind of take my story. And let's look at some examples of what this visually looks like. So I've created just a fictional story that, using this as a model, it's called Baker's Delight. And it's basically it's a comedic novel about a woman that starts her own bake shop despite the fact she knows nothing about baking, even though her last name is Baker. So again, just a fictional example here. So what we start off with is the title in the center, Baker's Delight. And then we want to branch into some plot ideas. So let's say she wants to focus on some secret recipes that maybe she got from her grandmother, or the fact that she's starting her own business and the difficulties that it is with starting your own business. Then the characters. Who are the main characters? We have Betty Ann Baker. She's a single mother and the owner of the bake shop. And then her daughter, Terry Baker, is a teenager. So this is clearly a very high-level example. I don't have a lot of space to get into full details, but basically what you want to do is further delve into details and keep fleshing out those details and exhaust it to the point of I cannot add anything more to this cluster, okay? Now, the snowflake outline method, these are some of the shapes that I was talking about. So the first point, or the first way that we work on this, is basically the main idea. You want to start with a one-sentence summary. Then the star, which will have the supporting plot points of the summary. And basically, you're expanding your sentence into one paragraph. Then you want to take this into a deeper dive and explicit points by developing your main character summary or character Bibles. Then the next step will be to create a structured and detailed model of the scale of your novel, including the characters and plot. And this is where it's going to be more detailed, because you're going to be adding basically going from one sentence to a paragraph to 1 page to 4 pages and so forth. So let's take a look at that just as a high-level view. The snowflake outline example with the triangle. So going back to our fictional story, Baker's Delight, Betty Ann Baker starts a bake shop with time, patience, and a whole lot of flour, bringing her family closer together like a braid of bread. Then the next step, supporting plot points of the summary from the one sentence to the paragraph. Baker's Delight is a comedic novel about a woman that starts her own bake shop despite the fact that she knows nothing about baking, even though her last name is Baker. A single mother raising her teenage daughter, Betty Ann Baker, starts a bake shop with time, patience, and a whole lot of flour, bringing her family closer together like a braided bread. So the next step is we're going to basically have some more explicit points of the character. So now I'm talking about her age and that she's a single mother, some of her character traits. So Betty Ann Baker, age 46, is a single mother that is ambitious, eager, and doubtful. While she likes to live life by flying by the seat of her pants, her goal is to prove to her family she can bake and turn her business into a great success despite the odds against her. She wants to inspire and her daughter to envision and live her dreams. So then again, further detailing this, as you can see, you're really building this sense of the snowflake, giving it more details. So you're going from one sentence to one paragraph to one page, building these snowflakes into further fractals. Then you would create a 4-page synopsis and scene list. And the important thing to remember about this outline and actually other outlines is revise and edit as needed as you go along the way. It's really important to just get all the ideas down and then kind of really figure out which ones stand out to you that have the strongest storyline to go with. So, some questions to ask yourself while outlining is the story building with excitement in each chapter? Again, I like to make sure my chapters are reading to the point that they're building suspense and interest and keeping the reader engaged, not just for the sake of creating words to just basically create more pages. You want to make a fluid building process with your story, which then asks the question, is the story building at a fluid pace? As a short story writer, I find this really interesting and challenging at the same time because I want to make sure that I am building a beginning and a middle and an end at a very nice, fluid, and balanced pace. I think it's easier with a novel as opposed to a short story because you have a shorter time frame to convey all of these points. But making sure you have enough balance and interest throughout is key. What is the main question of my story, and is it answered at the end? So again, going back to this contract, if you will, that you're creating with the reader, are you answering this question at the end? If you are not, are you leading to a sequel? And is there enough intensity and content to provide a hook that keeps people engaged to want to pick up where they last left off? Number 4, if there are multiple storylines within the novel, are they supported and addressed equally? This is really important because if you do have multiple storylines, you want to make sure that they are equally addressed. Why? Because if you don't do that, you can potentially lose the reader's interest or they might become confused on what you're trying to convey. So you really want to make sure all of those details are really fleshed out before you start adding those storylines in. Or you might actually find yourself writing and realize, I don't need that storyline, or it's not as important as I thought it was to the whole main theme of the story. Let's talk about some goals. Now, the creative process in writing is a very fluid process, and it definitely takes some time. So you would think, of course, outline mapping does take time to kind of flesh out all of the details. So one of the things I like to do in my writing is I try not to give myself a very rigid writing schedule because I feel like at times that puts pressure on me to deliver something that may or may not be to the best of my ability. But I do like to work in some goals to keep myself making sure that I'm checking in with my projects and making sure that I'm keeping up with them. So try to break up your mapping into time constraints or short term goals. Now, for example, it might take you only 1 to 2 weeks to work on a character profile, or maybe it's only a day or so. But set some realistic expectations for yourself of thinking, depending, of course, also on how fleshed out your story is, that it might take you a day, it might take you a week. But give yourself these kind of check-in points. So once you go through a week, go and revisit what you've written and see if it still holds true to what you want to do with your story, if it's still the main best way to deliver your story. Or also, it might take a week to develop a chapter 1 scene and the conflict. Maybe it takes 2 weeks. Again, give yourself a schedule, but try not to be so rigid with it that you feel like you're pushing yourself into a sense of writer's block. I have a few troubleshooting tips that I work with, kind of asking myself as I'm outlining a story, and I'm hoping this will help you as well. Number 1, have you fully fleshed out the entire story? So I sometimes think of stories that I jot down just a few ideas, and then I like to kind of go back and map these out. Do I have enough content? Is this really engaging? Do I get all of the details mapped out that ends up delivering this into either a short story or a full novel? It might take you some time to rework some sections of this, that you might have a story that you're really liking the way it's going, but you need to take some time to further put some details either into the characters or perhaps the plot. Which brings me to number 2. Are all plot lines and characters developed? Can they kind of stand on their own? Is there enough uniqueness and interest in the plot lines and characters? If not, take a step back and rework this until you really feel like you have exhausted all the possibilities for the way that you can develop your story. Number 3, will adding details hurt or help to support the overall main objective? So again, going back to the point of not wanting to just create words for the sake of creating words and paragraphs to create more page numbers, think of, is this really necessary to support the main theme of the story or not? If it's not, then chances are you either don't need it or it needs to be reworked to the point that it actually does help the main objective and understanding where you're going with the story. Number 4, shelf it. Taking breaks is actually a really good idea. There are times when I'll write something and I'll come back to it later, realizing I'm not liking the way it's going, or maybe this is not the direction I want to take this. So we can usually get so focused in on our projects that we kind of lose perspective at times. So sometimes taking a break a day or two, or perhaps even longer, to just get your mind off of it, come back to it, reread it, and see if this is the way you still want to go with it or not. Number 5, this is a hard one, but try not to overthink it. The way I like to think of when my work is done is basically, if I ask myself the question, can I do any better than what I've delivered? And if the answer is no, then I know I am finished with my story. So take some time, take some breaks, reread it, see how it reads, and just try not to overthink it. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. I have an author's notes article that kind of details a lot of these points that we talked about in this presentation. So for additional resources, please visit our resource center at www.redbicyclebooks.com/resource-center. And please feel free to leave any comments or questions or future topics that you'd like me to cover in the comment section. Thank you very much, and author on.